more about some of the artists behind this beautiful exhibition, Art of the Max. But before we bring out this amazing panel, I just want to make sure we recognize the Applebaum Family Foundation for their generous support of tonight's talk, as well as the entire exhibition for all of our visual arts programs. So how about a round of applause for the Applebaum Foundation? We have representatives in the house tonight, so we have Pamela Applebaum and Suzanne McKecken. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for your tremendous support of this wonderful program here. So without further ado, it's my honor to turn the stage over to Mr. Steve Panton, who's our wonderful curator of this exhibition. He's going to go ahead and introduce some of the artists, as well as our wonderful moderator tonight. So thank you so much for being here, and enjoy the talk.
Thanks so much, Chris. What a remarkable evening to program.
Do you want to sit here? So you can watch it? Here, come here. You want to sit here?
My name's Steve Panton. I organise the art here. What I'd like to do is just say a little bit about the background to the current exhibition, and say a little bit about the art by the artists who are on it particularly. This is the sixth iteration of Art of the Max. We're in the middle of three exhibitions. Was thinking about how can we pull together moments in visual art with moments in the orchestral sphere. And the first exhibition, which was the last exhibition, was about the moment where the conductor picks up the baton and the audience and the orchestra are all waiting for that gesture to start. So it was a very gestural show, symbolic gestures, gestural art making, and so on. In this show, what I was thinking about was moments of transformation. And originally what I was thinking was the moment in which the orchestra starts. But I soon realized that the orchestra hall is a place of far broader transformation. It's a place where people listen and transform that into emotion. It's a place where, as art in general, it has a transformative effect. So the theme for the show is art of transformation and sort of portals to other experiences. So if you remember when you come through the front door, the first piece you see is a painting, has a portrait wall from an artist called Mr. Mel Roses, who we're going to speak to about that later. So I'm not going to say too much more about the work, but it's to say it's from the Portal series, and there's three masterful paintings from that series that we're very happy to show here. Also on the ground floor, you may have noticed that there's a ping pong table that's been cut into facets and reordered into a phenomenal wall-mounted sculpture, and that's by an artist called Mr. Graham White, who again I'm not going to say too much more about because we're going to hear quite a lot from Graham later. But then on the second floor we have three pieces by a veteran abstract painter called David Rubello, and they're hard-edged geometric abstract pieces, but they glow with an emotion. And David Rubello sees colour as an expression of pure emotion, different types of emotion, but it's a transformation of emotion into colour for him. Unfortunately, David's down in Florida at the moment preparing for the show, so he can't be here. And then on this floor we have another piece by Mel Roses, and then over to the left here we have a cabinet that's floating off the floor. It's called, I think, Kryptonite Wares by an artist called Rose de Sluva, who, Rose, we're very grateful that you've loaned us the piece, and Rose is in the audience, wearing a form of kryptonite green, I think. So Rose sees kryptonite as having a particular type of energy, a protective energy, and in a way this is a career-defining piece. It concentrates all that energy into this one cabinet, and Rose told me a story, and I observed it too, that when the cabinet's lit up, you find people sort of standing a little bit back from it. It's got kind of a certain energy. On the back wall over there, there's a wonderful video by an artist called Ash Arda, who I'm not going to say too much more about because Ash is here on the panel and we're going to hear quite a lot from her later. But in a way, the video, which takes fragments of video of iconic jazz musicians, but it takes away the instruments and it takes away the sounds, so you sort of focus on the breath, how the origin of sound is in the breath. And in a way, that video is sort of the closest to how I originally imagined the exhibition, but it's a video, I think it's about 2 minutes, but I've probably watched it 100 times and I'll for sure will watch it 100 more. And then we have this piece over here on the wall. It almost is the wall. So this piece was part of a remarkable evening's programming that was done in the Venison Park, Sculpture Park, which the DSO programs in. It was built as a skateboard half ramp, and it was built for an event in which a well-known improvising jazz pianist, Jason Moran, improvised at the same time as skateboarders were improvising, and the two were working collectively. The working surfaces of the half pipe are the ones that you see here that are painted, were painted by a legendary cast corridor artist called Mr. Bob Sestock, who we have in the audience here. They're inspired by the Louise Nevelson sculpture, but also inspired by the rhythm of the skateboarders. And now the piece is a collaboration between the mops of the skateboarders and the painting. So, thank you, Paige. I just wanted to introduce the artists who lived here. Oh, there's one more, Megan Harris, I'm sorry, I almost forgot. On the 4th floor, please take a look at it as you leave. It's artwork that creates artwork. It's an artwork for creating paintings. It's an artwork where you can see that moment where the painting starts, so fit very clearly into the theme of the show. I don't want to say too much more. I want to introduce LaToya Cross, who is going to be our moderator for this evening. Thank you so much, LaToya, for agreeing to do that. LaToya is a graduate of journalism from Columbia University, I think, Columbia College in Chicago. Was the arts and culture editor for Ebony and Jet magazines, and is now the producer. He's come back to Detroit and is the producer for WDET's Culture Shift, which is an online culture magazine program that airs from 12 till 2 every weekday. Clearly a very important program. So, and also LaToya is the writer of the latest essay in the essay project. So very multi-talented. LaToya, I want to hand that over to you. I think we're going to talk a little bit to the artist one at a time, and then we're going to talk about the theme of transformation. And then we'll open it up for questions. So.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. That was great, walking us through the exhibition. So I think I just want to start off with the idea of transformation and even taking it back to the most impactful piece of art that you've experienced. And how did that make you feel? And with that, what curiosities did you have, what questions did you have that you're able to carry through your art practice today?
Go sit up front. There's room up front. Get a better view.
Take a stab at.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't know if it was actually any particular work of art, but I do recall when I was in undergraduate school, I had the assignment of reading, this is a modern art class up through 1945. We were given the assignment of reading the surrealist manifesto. And I think that had great impact on my work. And I have to honestly say I like the manifesto more than I like the artwork itself. But maybe when I was a youth, I really looked up to artists like Salvador Dali, but maybe not so much anymore. But I do like the idea that's behind this surrealist manifesto in the sense that they look to Freud and his importance in dreamlike imagery as a way to sort of like understand another dimension of the psyche, and that helped to sort of like provide some of the ideas that I'm still working with today, together with my interest in magic realism literature, aspects of Latin American culture have always been influential in my work, which is part of my heritage. And so for me it was that. It was more of a philosophy more than a group of artists. I've always looked very much at all kinds of art. I was very much affected when I was younger by the old masters, as you can tell. But I also love contemporary art. I love the paintings of Gerhard Richter. So for me it was more of a philosophy more than a specific book.
I guess for me, some of the first stuff that I really was drawn to was more architectural in nature. And that was my introduction to the art world anyway. I came at sculpture through architecture. So first seeing works of Frank Lloyd Wright or Park Place or Gustav and how they transform space as it relates to the show. Those were kind of my first the things that grabbed hold and were memorable.
That's a really big question. I'm lucky to go last because I was thinking, I think I'm going to go ahead with the musical art form, surprise, surprise. And I feel like the first time that I realized that I was very impacted by art was when I realized that I knew the words to certain jazz songs that I didn't recall being interested in. Was listening to a lot of it as a child, just, by default because my father was listening to that. And I think I was in undergrad when songs came on and I realized I knew the words, and it was like, I don't even think I like this type of music. Where did this come from? Why do I know this? And then I remembered hot summer days in Flint, being in the car, and feeling something, even as a really young person, maybe 4 or 5, feeling the music and emoting, even if I didn't understand what was happening conceptually in the music. But I think for me, transformation occurs when, through visual art or sonic art, music, when I feel. And yeah, I think for me it's, yes, a philosophy. I'm more interested in the philosophy, but also, yeah, does it make me feel something, good or bad?
I think that you touched on something there with even if you don't understand. And I think that even with art, I think that's an attractive point, an attractive aspect, an entry way into art, is that it is a feeling. You may look at something and it's aesthetically pleasing, but then what's deeper within that? Mel, you spoke about magical realism, and we see that a lot in the works presented in this exhibition. So can you talk about you spoke about the philosophy, but the pieces in your work and how we talked about this kind of stillness, but the use of space, the use of colors and windows that kind of transport you to wandering possibility.
Well, just to give you a bit of history, my father came to this country in the late 40s to be a foreign student. And he came from the country of Panama. And so with him came his music, his record albums, Latin music, and his remarkable, fantastic stories that I would listen to as a kid. And so when I finally was introduced to people like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and like Isabel Allende from Chile and Juan Rulfo and those kinds of writers, they seem very, very familiar to me. It's almost as if my father's stories were sort of lifted from one of those books of short stories. And so they were very familiar, but still very foreign, kind of paradoxically speaking. And so, and then I think back to my days as an undergraduate student. I had a very influential teacher that introduced me to Zen Buddhism and the very famous grandfather of all the magic realists, Borges, Luis Jose Borges is his name. But he was absolutely amazing. And so that gave me cause to really start thinking about alternative planes of consciousness and different ways of thinking about reality. And so for my work, I've always, people call me a realist, but I would probably sit down and talk to them for a good hour as to why I'm not a realist, right? Because I'm always interested in bending reality, trying to figure out how I can sort of ask questions with the imagery and invite people into the viewing experience. The use of the portal has always been for me kind of a symbol of a passage of time and space and consciousness. You go from one plane into another, and then you're transformed. That's the term transformation. But that's basically where it came from. It came from my father's influence, my undergraduate influence with a very influential teacher, and then later on I sort of discovered these writers.
And then just the approach to narrative within your pieces. How do you go about that? What informs the narrative? Is it place? Is it title? Is it an idea?
It's a lot of things, you know, and I never know where the next idea is going to come from. Because I could be sitting at a table and eavesdropping on somebody's conversation, maybe in Havana, you know, and just listen to what they're saying, and it's like, bingo, one sentence. That's the title of the painting. I got to do something with that. Or it could be a slang, the use of slang in Spanish, or it could be something I read in a short story. It could be someplace that I experienced. You know, any number of things can influence the work.
And then the ground, your work, when you explore the relationship with architects and the fine art, architecture and fine art, how did you reach that idea of like, this is, I want to rearrange things or reimagine the use of an object?
Well, it kind of comes about in different ways for different pieces or different styles of working. So I make both objects, but then I also manipulate space in that my wife and I run Pop's Packing, if you're unfamiliar, which is a community art space in Hamtramck. So depending on which mode I'm working in, it can vary. But as it relates to the piece downstairs, that was, you know, a lot of times I'll use something that I have already. Because one, it's cheaper, and two, it's and two, it's, you know, there's an inherent language there already. There's some bits you can grab onto. Exactly. So for that piece, you know, actually like Mel, thinking of alternate planes, and that, you know, reimagine the literal plane of the ping pong table, but then the metaphorical plane of existence, and then reconfiguring that, and then transforming, instead of it being a game where you're trying to defeat the other person, it becomes a game of collaboration. So that piece was originally shown as a ping pong table, and it was more about trying to keep the ball in motion. And so, kind of metaphorically, it's about like, how can we work together to have this, you know, this kind of plane of existence. And now it's been transformed again 8 years later for this show, and so I like that as well.
And that was very interesting to me because Steve, I walked through the exhibit with Steve a couple of weeks ago, and he pointed out to me that they mounted it, and it was actually a ping pong table. So, with your work being one that is very participatory and one that invites play, how then, with it being on mounted, how does that change the experience, or what do you think? Does it add to it?
Yeah, I don't know, it's still sinking in, because I just did that when the show opened, so I'm still kind of wrapping my head around that, I guess, but you know, it's not as interactive now, but I think it's maybe more meditative, and so it's different in that way. But a lot of my work, you know, sculpture is kind of a, you know, a horrible beast in that it takes up space. And if you aren't lucky enough to sell work, then you have to store it somewhere. So it's also a matter of necessity. Being able to put something on the wall makes it a little easier in some ways. So sometimes I'll work in a way where it's, hey, I'm really trying to get this idea across, and sometimes it's something that just kind of happens, and you know, I'm willing to go with the flow or modify pieces as needed. So.
And we spoke too, because if you look at it when you're downstairs, and it's right on the wall that it says the cube, right in the corner. And so I asked myself, was that intentional? Because it then plays into, it's like an invitation to go into the cube as well. That was kind of cool to me, I don't know. but Steve, on that, in curating this exhibition, and the choice to mount the ping pong table, is that something that you would have done had it been in a traditional gallery or a museum, or was it specifically because of the space that you're operating in?
One of the requirements of the DSO is that nothing can stand on the floor, so that's why the cabinet is mounted, and that's why so many of the things are mounted. But I do think that it energizes the walls, and I can honestly say that from almost the first time I taught here, I wanted to put Graham's piece on a wall here. So it is very different. It's more sculptural, but sometimes you just see pieces and they have to go on a particular wall. And so, yeah, thanks Graham for doing the engineering to put it up there.
And then, so we spoke about it becoming transforming into a meditative piece too. And then with Ash, with your work, called Untitled Mean Wing. And you eliminate the sound, we can recognize the musicians, and it kind of takes away the element of outcome and forces us into looking at the practice and the act of something being done. So can you take us behind the psychology of Mean Wind?
Mean Wind was created as a meditation. So a lot of the way that I work is the works that get shown in spaces, for me, are not really resolved, finished pieces. I don't know if that exists in my practice. When I worked, that piece really was me sort of trying to work through a concept in my head. It so happened that there was something that a curator could call and say, hey, do you have some artwork that fits this sort of category? So it's meant to sort of have you stand in front of it and silently kind of reflect and go into an internal space. So as you said, there isn't an anticipated or expected any one outcome. But how it was created was I was reading a computer science white paper on strategies for simulating naturally occurring phenomena. So the rustling of digital trees, right? If you're looking at a video game or an animation, really there's just a bunch of math behind how to get the leaves to move in a convincing way. And so this started to me, there were terms that were used in that paper, and it almost felt like an alternative world or space, right? I'm not a scientist, I'm not a computer scientist, so I'm reading this research paper as a kind of visual artist, right? And so I was noting things that were strange to me, terms like wind primitives, and mean wind was actually one of the terms referenced. So at the end of the paper, 6 days later, after I struggled through this like computer science white paper, I had a list of terms, and mean wind really kind of stuck with me, and I started to think about within my own sort of like experience, what would be the sort of like average wind, right? Like if you could think of a thing that relates to the way that I move throughout the world, or the way that my ancestors might have moved throughout the world, what would be the average sources of wind? Where would they come from? What would they feel like, sound like, look like? And immediately I just went to music. And yeah, that piece sort of surfaced as a result of me doing a bunch of basically like research into musicians and the way that their bodies produce wind. Then, yeah, sort of decentralizing the instrument, but then focusing on the very sort of corporeal experience of generating wind as a human being. It's kind of like, you know, where that came from.
It's cerebral. You know, it's very, yeah, it makes you pause, you know, even if your mind is going and maybe imagining the sound, because as I said, like we're familiar, you know, with the artist and the piece, but taking that away and forcing us to not just focus on the sound, but to look at the practice of, you know, and kind of conjure our thoughts at the same time. Identity, you know, I think as what I enjoy about art is kind of that search and trying to, even if you, like we talked about earlier, even if we don't understand, you know, there's some piece of connection within the feeling. So in trying and figuring out narrative and searching for identity within your pieces, is that part of, does that inform your work in any aspect?
I have to say yes, absolutely. No, it's, you know, I grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, and, you know, it wasn't exactly a place that I felt at home. It's a pretty conservative state even now, but it was even worse back in the 1950s. But, you know, so I eventually left, you know, and to go to graduate school in Philadelphia. Of course, I felt like I fit in much better there. But then, the first time I went to visit my father's homeland of Panama, as soon as I got off that plane, I felt very, very gringo, very much the foreigner. So the question for me growing up and as a young adult is, where exactly is my place? Where do I fit in? Where's my home? Who are my people? What is my identity? And so, little by little over time, further I got into creative elements in life, I found that my home was in art. You know, as corny as it sounds, I mean, it's the place where I felt most at home. As a kid, I was always drawing in my bedroom and spending hours doing that stuff. My parents would come in and see what I was doing. So that for me was really the most important thing. The only other thing I was passionate about was baseball. And I'm really glad I didn't try to do that, because I wouldn't have been good enough, I don't think. But no, identity is very, very much a big thing. And now, for many years, my work has always been a kind of search for cultural identity through the culture itself. Very much interested in the language of Spanish. Spanish is my second language. The music, the customs, the use of colors is incredibly passionate. And even in places like Guatemala, where the indigenous populations are so incredibly huge, the color gets really symbolic. It gets referenced to certain directions within the power wheel in terms of what they refer to it. So color is something that has been very important as well. So yeah, it's very much about a kind of search for cultural identity for me.
I guess for me, I don't know if I'd say identity, but maybe more place. Again, the creation of space, of place, of venues, as it were, and those interactions that may or may not occur within those spaces. I think that's more central to my work. A lot of what I do is about creating space, whether it's through Pops Packing in our little compound where others can come in, you know, we can invite collaborations or just, you know, enjoy the presence of each other. But then also some of the more personal works I make might be about just personal space. So, but there's always kind of that, you know, because I've always seen space as being, you know, a nice complement to sculpture and architectural space versus sculptural space. So I think that's something I would focus on a lot in my work is that kind of give and take.
Identity for me plays out in my work probably in the way that I work in a hybrid sort of way. I was talking to someone earlier about, I don't make any one type of artwork. Usually I'm inspired by something or I have a question about something. Doesn't matter the discipline. And I think I've always sort of been that way. I've existed in a lot of different spaces all the time. I played sports, I was in theater, I was, you know, doing quiz bowl, like any, you know. So I think I got used to sort of having to code switch and be in a lot of different social and cultural and physical, geographical environments. And feeling the permission to do all those things. So yeah, I think how it shows up in my work is that I collaborate with non-artists sometimes to make artworks. With this piece in particular, the reason I was looking at a computer science paper in the first place was because I had become really fascinated with, one, I'm just interested in plant-people relationships in general. That's sort of the anchor to my work. I had become interested in plant-people relationships as exist digitally and on screens. So that was why I was even looking at that paper, right? It wasn't even about, this is what the result was, which is very different than the reason why I started reading it. But just that, the fact that that could even happen, I think, is what happens to me minute by minute, day by day. And so I feel like identity for me changes very often, and I feel okay about that. I feel good about the fact that being in this body, in this place and time, I can take the permission to kind of do what I want creatively, because I know that that might have not have always been the case.
With the stories being told within your art, you talk about symbolism.